Although I consider myself a liberal where social issues are concerned, I must disagree with the left's love affair with Islam. As a progressive who supports equal rights for people regardless of their sexual orientation, their sex, their gender, or their race, I cannot in good conscience support a religion that discriminates against people based on these factors. There are 10 Islamic nations where homosexuality is punishable by death. These are Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Mauritania, Nigeria, Sudan, Somalia, Afghanistan, Yemen, and Brunei. There are also 12 Islamic nations where stoning women to death for adultery is legal. These are Iran, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Mauritania, Saudi Arabia, Somalia, Sudan, Yemen, and northern Pakistan. In a 2013 Pew study, 86% of Muslims polled said that wives must always obey their husbands. The Penal Code of Iran imposes a fine of 10 days or a stay of 2 months in prison as a punishment for the failure to wear a hijab in public. Many Muslim nations have similar laws, even where there's no law regarding the hijab. Most women in the areas like Gaza know that if they don't wear it, they'll still be harassed on the streets. In some areas, they also know that regardless of what the law says, they can be subject to so-called honor killings or other violent retributions for failing to wear a hijab. If the hijab and the burqa are personal choices, and if they're not symbols of oppression, then why don't men wear them as well? Why is it that only women choose to wear them? Are Muslim women more righteous and holy than Muslim men? Or could it be that women have to take responsibility for Muslim men's sexual urges because Muslim men aren't mature or responsible enough to control themselves? According to Human Rights Watch 2013, Afghanistan has one of the highest incident rates of domestic violence in the world. Domestic violence is so common that 85% of women admit to experiencing it. 60% of all women report being victims of multiple forms of serial violence. Afghanistan is the only country in which female suicide rate is at 80% higher than the males. Psychologists attribute this to an endless cycle of domestic violence and poverty that's impossible to escape. Now that the United States has pulled out of Afghanistan, it will be interesting to see those numbers and how they change. I'm willing to bet they will continue to increase. According to a World Health Organization study, 30% of women in rural Bangladesh reported their first sexual experience to be forced. About 40% of Bangladeshi women reporting having experienced domestic violence from their intimate partner, and 50% in rural regions report experiencing sexual violence. 16 to 19% of the women less than 50 years old were victims of domestic violence within the last year. 40 to 47% of the women had been victims of domestic violence during some period of their life. About 90% of the women in Bangladesh are practicing Muslims, demonstrating that many Muslim women are victims of physical domestic violence in this country. The study also found that less than 2% of domestic abuse victims seek support from the community to resolve abusive situations because they know that they won't receive any support from the community. In fact, the community in Muslim nations usually resorts to victim blaming instead, and in extreme cases, even beating or stoning to death the victims. There are similar results from many other Muslim nations. An in-depth study is beyond the scope of this video, but here's a few highlights. A 2012 United Nations Women's Study found that 33% of women in Egypt have experienced physical domestic violence in their lifetime, while 18% report having experienced domestic physical violence in the last 12 months. The World Health Organization reported sharply increasing rates of domestic violence in Indonesia, with over 25,000 cases in 2007. A World Health Organization study in Babol, Iran found that within the previous year, 15% of wives had been physically abused, 42.4% had been sexually abused, and 81.5% had been psychologically abused to various degrees by their husbands. The 2012 United Nations Women's Study found that at least 1 in 5 women in Jordan had experienced physical domestic violence in their lifetime, while 1 in 7 reports have experienced at least one domestic violence incident in the last year. A 2011 report claims that 80% of women in Pakistan suffer from domestic abuse. A 2004 study claimed 50% of the women in Pakistan are physically battered and 90% are mentally and verbally abused by their spouses. Saudi Arabia's National Family Protection Program estimates that 35% of Saudi women have experienced violence. A 2009 study published by the government of Turkey reports widespread domestic violence against women in Turkey. In urban and rural areas, 40% of Turkish women reported having experienced domestic violence in their lifetime. 10% of all women reported domestic abuse within the last 12 months. In the 15 to 24-year-old age group, 20% of the women reported domestic violence by their husbands or male members of their family. This violence ranged from slapping, battering, to other forms of violence, including sexual violence. The injuries as a result of the reported domestic violence included bleeding, broken bones, and other forms of serious medical crisis needing attention. Over half reported severe injuries. A third of all women who admitted domestic violence abuse claimed to have suffered repeated domestic violence injuries in excess of 5 or more times. What about other types of abuse in addition to domestic violence? Well, currently there are 13 countries where atheists can be executed legally. Care to guess how many of those states are not Islamic nations? These countries are Afghanistan, Iran, Malaysia, Maldives, Mauritania, Nigeria, Pakistan, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Somalia, Libya, the United Arab Emirates, and Yemen. We often hear about how radical Muslims are only a small part of the overall Islamic population. So how small a part are they? According to a study conducted by the Pew Forum, 48% of all Muslims favor the death penalty for leaving Islam. 67% believe Sharia law should rule Muslims. 44% believe that Sharia law should rule everybody, not just Muslims. 85% of all Muslims believe that their wives should obey the husband without question. 53% of all Muslims favor stoning women who commit adultery. 49% of all Muslims favor cutting off the hands of people who steal. Obviously, the radical Muslims are more than just a small minority. Even if they were just a minority, I can't help but wonder why the moderate majority of Muslims don't do something to speak out against the radicals for tainting all of Islam with their behaviors. All of the reasons listed in this video, and many more not mentioned here, are why I cannot in good conscience support those who support Islam. And before the Christians watching this video get too overjoyed with its contents, I would remind them that most forms of Christianity are just as radical when it comes to minority rights. But that's the subject for another video.